She's an associate professor, as it is written over there, mechanical and industrial engineering, University of Toronto. No? So I've known Amy since the time of COVID. She was to come here way back in February 2020.
March, I think, actually.
Yeah. And just 2 days before the COVID shutdown, she had to cancel her visit. So there's a collaboration with the University of Toronto going on. Almost 9 professors from IIT Bombay and equal number from there we have been working. And she also is the director of Center for Global Engineering, something similar to what we have Prayog over here. And she is director of the Water and Energy Research Lab. Interestingly, her PhD student Monisha has come here before. She works in the area of fecal sludge management. And we are trying to work some more in-depth collaboration. So I invite Amy. Welcome to IIT and Sitara.
Thanks for the intro, Rakul. Can you all hear me if I use the mic, or can you all hear me? Is it okay if I don't use the mic? Perfect. I like it better without the mic, so I'll just try to use I think it's okay if I use the big voice. So let me know just if it gets too quiet. If I get too quiet, just pop your hand up so I know that it's too quiet. So it's a pleasure to meet you all. When Bakul suggested that I come and give a talk, I said yes, let's do it. So I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing in my research group. This is just really going to be a little bit of a sampler in terms of some of the things that we're doing. And really the work that we're doing within my research group, which is called the Water and Energy Research Lab, really focuses on thinking about how we can advance the Sustainable Development Goals. These are things as students of Sitara that you're very, very familiar with, so I'm not going to talk too much about the SDGs. But particularly in my group, we think a lot about particularly SDG 6 as well as some of the others. So SDG 6 is thinking about providing clean water and sanitation to everyone. And I think the key for that is thinking about the fact that you're trying to not only think about technologies which can advance clean water and sanitation, but trying to think about how that can be advanced to the last mile populations. So the SDGs, they were developed and started in 2015 as a subsequent to the Millennium Development Goals. And they've done an assessment just back in 2022 to think about how they're doing. How are they getting towards the goal of being able to provide these essential elements to everyone. Thinking about SDG 6, just these are some of the targets that they had set to be able to achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water, and to be able to think about achieving access to adequate and equitable sanitation, sanitation and hygiene, and then as well across every demographic. So, but looking at how they're doing, this is a plot showing what things looked like when the SDGs started back in 2015 compared to 2022. Anyone here think that we're going to reach universal access to clean water and sanitation by 2023, and halfway through the SDGs mandate? We've barely had any movement. Access to safe and affordable drinking water. People without access has gone from 2.3 billion to 2.2 billion. Sanitation has gone from 3.8 to 3.5. So there is some progress, but as it stands right now, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to meet those types of goals, unless something dramatic happens. And what makes this even more poignant is when you're thinking about the populations that are limiting access, that have limited access to these types of technologies, most of them are focused in the global south. So thinking about this really kind of frames some of the work that we're doing. There's been a lot of work that's been done, thinking about these challenges, thinking about SDG 6, thinking about safe water and sanitation. There's been a lot of work around toilets, but despite the fact that there's been a lot of work done, there's still more than 2 billion people that lack access to basic sanitation. And lots of work is done around water, installing water pumps, other things, but they are still not adequate. They still are not operated and maintained in a good way. And so, for example, there's about 60,000 hand pumps that are installed every year in Africa. About each year, but about 66% of them will fall into disrepair. So we need to think about, when we're doing design, how we can think about, really addressing some of the core issues that are at hand and be able to really advance and move towards universal access to water and sanitation. People sometimes have inventive ideas, but really, sometimes they really miss the mark. Is this a case study you guys have seen? Anyone heard about this? This is actually example of something that was thought of in the context of Africa. In 1987, this idea was presented at an agricultural fair. The idea behind it was that this is a lot of places needed access to water. Getting water up and pumping it from the ground is really an energy-intensive process. Kids need a place to play. So why don't we think about using the energy from kids to be able to pump the water up to an elevated water tank, and then later people can come and collect water from these watering points. So this idea was presented. They raised huge amounts of money to support it. People thought, oh, maybe this sounds like a great idea, right? They raised money from organizations like the Clinton Foundation, all these different organizations, millions and millions of dollars. And in the end, it's seen as one of the biggest examples of a global development failure and a classic case study for different reasons. And if you think, anyone have any ideas? In the end, it was a huge failure. Anyone have any ideas what some of the root causes of that failure is? Any guesses? So, actually, if you're thinking about all aspects, this was just a really poorly designed system and the poorly designed implementation towards the system. So I'm an engineer, I'm going to start from the technical downfalls of something like this. How many hours a day do you think kids might play on one of these? Yeah, one, maybe 5, right? Maybe 5 if you're really, really lucky. After it was completed, they did an analysis, just a purely technical analysis of this, and the kids would have to play 30 hours a day, to collect it up. So actually, it's not even physically possible, right? And the implementation of this too, they installed these water pumps in areas where there were previously, so digging a well is expensive, right? And they wanted to limit some of their costs, so they actually installed them where there were previous wells, and sometimes there were pumps there before. But now, those sites, instead of having a pump which was dignified for a woman to use to pump water, when that woman would go to collect water, it's always women, and the kids would only play for 1 minute a day, there's no water in the water tank. So what's a woman going to have to do if they're going to actually try to get water from this well? They're going to have to play, right? They're going to have to cold spin this around. So it's super undignified. The pump itself was really inefficient. It was super unreliable. So from all these different aspects, this is seen as a huge failure. So first, they didn't really understand the engineering requirements to find the problem. They didn't really understand the social considerations when they're thinking about this design. They didn't think about all these different aspects when thinking about implementation, which are really important if you're going to be able to take something which really is going to be able to make a positive impact. So as engineers, we don't want this to happen, right? So we want to be able to think about, and really, really, really comprehensive when we're thinking about design, when we're thinking about how we develop technologies within this space. So really, in the group, and as a result of some of these types of designs, many technologies that are developed within this space will miss the mark. That water pump was an example, and sometimes people working within this space will try to take something which is designed for a different context and patchwork and work it into another context. where it's not really addressing the core problem. So when we're thinking within this space, we need to really think, and how I like to think about some of the things that we try to do is we try to think about this in the context, we're engineers, we work with people outside the engineering field, but a lot of times I like to try to start at least thinking about it in terms of the engineering design process. So really first understanding and identifying what the core problem is really key. And then the other part, I was just talking about the plate pump as an example, is that they really didn't understand what the requirements were. So we need to also think about, when we're going through this overall process, how we can make sure that we're defining those requirements appropriately, to be able to think about technology to make an impact. So in my group, we work kind of throughout this overall engineering design process space. We will actually develop new ideas and new problems. But then we also think about how we can think about this design process in a better way, how we can think about how we can iterate within this process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a few case studies that we've been working through, thinking about new concepts within this space, and then thinking more comprehensively about what makes something that is going to make an impact. So in my group, we work in a broad range of areas. So we work on systems related to water treatment, energy systems, technology related to agriculture, and then overall related to thinking about how we can do this type of design in a more appropriate way. I'm going to focus in, we do a lot of different things in my group, and my student would agree there's a lot of different things going on within the group. So I'm going to pick just a couple examples to walk through today, just to kind of give you a flavor of what they are. And if you have questions about any of these other topics that I'm not going to have a chance to talk about, feel free to come up and chat with me afterwards, and we can get into more of the nitty-gritty details. So I'm going to start by going through an example within the agriculture space that probably resonates with some of the things that you experience with some of the things that you're doing in Satara. So this project actually started back prior to the pandemic. We were supporting a number of projects in Nicaragua. A number of projects where this NGO was installing drip irrigation systems. And when we were actually doing a lot of the consultation with the farmers during that process, there was one kind of common variable or one common problem which was brought up by many of those farmers. So this is an example of a particular farmer. He was really concerned with, thinking about how he could be water efficient. He was trying to do all sorts of things. So there's a picture there where he was reforesting a part of his farm. He had set up these trees, he had planted trees and then set up bottles with like a little hole at the top so he could drip water right at the base. He had set up his own pump, which was liquid diesel powered, which would pump up the elevated tank that then he would put into this drip irrigation system. But one thing that he noted, and other farmers noted when we were talking to them, is that they really didn't know how much they should be watering their crops. He did it pretty ad hoc, probably putting too much water on, and he just really, I guess he really wanted to be able to think about how he could do that more efficiently, because for him it was expensive to pump water, and he was also noticing the fact that the water table in that particular region kept on going deeper, dropping down and further down. So he was really concerned with thinking about how can he water his crops more effectively. So we worked and we developed kind of a set of basic requirements thinking about this problem. We were working with a group which was doing these drip irrigation systems, and there wasn't stable electricity, and we wanted to think about making an accessible device which could support the farmers to think about how they could water their crops in an efficient way. So with that in mind, we started with boiling what was going on down to really the fundamental aspects. So within, I think within engineering, if you're able to understand the fundamentals of what's going on, sometimes you can think about things from a slightly different way. So we started to think more about what happens when water goes into the soil. And so just thinking about that, soil is a porous media, right? When it rains, or if you take soil and the soil's really dry, that soil's going to soak water into it, right? And how quickly it soaks up that water will be related to this parameter called soil water potential. So when it's really dry, it's going to soak that water up really quickly, as long as it's not packed down super, super tight, right? Plants don't like it when it's really, really dry. Plants like it actually when it's somewhere, there's a little bit of air within the soil matrix, and it has a parameter soil water potential around negative 30 kilopascal. And then when it's saturated, basically there's no more water which can go in there. Basically water will pool on top. It had a soil water potential of 0 kilopascal. So we were looking at this parameter of soil water potential, and we realized, oh, we're mechanical engineers, and this is a pressure. We understand what pressures are. Pressure means that you can get a force and you can do something with that force. So we thought about, is there something we can do if we want to think about this property, to think about an appropriate technology which can enable the farmers to be able to water their crops and be able to make sure that they do it in an efficient way. So with that in mind, we set through our design process and we came up with a concept, and I'll explain it in a minute, which basically met those requirements. We could put it in a gravity-fed drip irrigation system. Doesn't really need electricity, doesn't need tools or expertise. That's an initial prototype here. We have a much more refined version of the design now, but I think we can use it to take a look at understanding how the idea works. So this is the basic concept. So you've got your soil, which is porous, and can actually exert a pressure to draw water down to the soil when the soil's dry. What we have is a ceramic tip, which is buried down in the soil, which is in good contact with the soil. And then we have basically a pipe with water, basically connected up with water on the right-hand side. And then we have a valve mechanism, which can open and close water flow into the drip irrigation network based on what's happening in that reservoir on the right. So what happens if the soil is dry? Water will be drawn out through the ceramic tip into the surrounding soil, right? And then that would basically happen, and we would basically open up this valve if the soil is dry. And then consequently, when the soil becomes moist, water would get drawn back up into the controller and close up this valve. So that's the concept we have overall. So we're still in the process of really taking this up to scale. But this is one of our tests which we did in a greenhouse at University of Toronto, which demonstrates the concept. So you can see here, this orange line shows the pressure in the soil. The gray line shows the pressure in the controller, and that blue line at the bottom shows when there's water flowing through the controller. So you can see the soil pressure drop and the controller pressure drop, and then the valve will open, water will be applied, and then the pressure comes back up. So what's nice about this concept is that really the forces that the controller is seeing mimics the forces that a plant would see and the roots of the plant would see. So a plant really likes to be within this certain range because of soil water potential, because that's related to how easy it is to draw the water out of the soil. So basically, we can tune this to kind of set the point which would be in the range that a plant likes to be at. So we've done some analysis to look at what happens when we could scale this up for a plot. This is like if we looked at a plot close to our facility in Toronto, and took some environmental data from that plot, and then we compared what would happen if what would happen if we use this controller based on the parameters we have, and what would happen if we did what the farmers reported they were doing, which was using standard timing irrigation where they open it for a certain amount of minutes per day. And we found for this particular case that the controller could reduce water usage by about 75% while still being able to kind of maintain a good soil, like a good soil moisture for the crops. So has a lot of promise. So we've been refining the valve design in the lab and the mechanism, and then we will be in the process. We will be going and actually testing this out with partners to be able to look at more of a controlled field test, where we actually are implementing the controller side by side with just a timer system to look at water usage and yield between two test plots, and then also doing focus groups with farmers to assess the aspects of the valve and continue to iterate through that overall design process. So this is one example of working through that design process that we've been doing within my group currently. I'll talk about another case that we've been working on. This was a case looking at sanitation, and a project which is being done by one of my PhD students in my group, Pablo Cotera. So Pablo is a really interesting character. He's from Mexico, and during the pandemic, he was in Toronto, but then he really expressed a desire to be able to spend a lot of his time in Mexico. So he's been focusing his case study and his work based on the context of what he sees around Mexico City, where he lives, in some of the peri-urban areas. So this is the areas, around the urban fringe, the informally settled areas. And this is a picture that he took from one of those sites where there's no piped water or sewerage. It's really prone to flooding because there's no drainage set up in these areas. There is a high groundwater as well, and relatively high population density. So this was he was looking at trying to understand how he could help fill in this space, thinking about sanitation, and he was going through and looking at what's feasible. And he came to the idea of thinking about dry toilets, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the barriers for thinking about dry toilets, but he was thinking dry toilets could be something which could work. There's no piped water. These are water-stressed areas, so you don't want a water-based toilet. So why not a dry toilet? So maybe it makes sense. There's something which is easy to build and maintain. We don't need water. These are water-stressed areas that don't have piped water. And he actually went through, and in the early phases of his work, he actually did some focus groups and interviews with residents. He also actually worked with them. They have one of the sanitation solutions that they do have is they have pour flush toilets, which they will basically pour water in, and then they just have a pit which is used to hold the sewerage. So it kind of has a lot of advantage. It doesn't have the need for flushing water. There's local availability of different dry materials you can use for the dry toilets. And there's possibility you can think about doing the management of the waste either locally or taking it off-site. And that you can actually relatively easily think about inactivating the pathogens through composting. So it seemed like it could be a feasible alternative. But thinking about being able to do this, he wanted to think about, is it possible that you could think about doing this on site? But the composting process can be something which can be pretty challenging. This is a picture also that Pablo took. So thinking about composting, you need to be able to get the temperatures up high enough for long enough to be able to get the pathogen inactivation. So in a lot of the composting, you need to be able to adjust and monitor the process. You need to have a lot of, if you're going to do a lot of the composting which was done is something which is relatively large. And if you're going to do something large, you need to have some sort of community level engagement. And I think what they found is that what he found was that if you wanted to bring it down to a household level, there were lots of challenges there. Anything that he found in literature and anything that was reported, the smallest composting volumes that he found for something which didn't require a lot of active inputs was 1 meter cubed of compost, which is a lot, and especially in these dense peri-urban environments, something which wouldn't necessarily be feasible. So Pablo wanted to try to see if he could address this challenge and try to think about how we could think about smaller volumes. So he's thinking about a urine diverting dry toilet. The idea is you could set up a toilet booth like this, where you basically reduce the volumes to start off with by diverting the urine from the feces, and then use smaller volume containers, something around around 60 liters. And how can we think about this in the context of sanitation? So what he was trying to do is try to think about, is it feasible to shrink what has been seen in literature down from the 1,000 liters, and this is an image to scale, to something which could be on the scale that could be done on a household and fit into this type of toilet, something that's around 60 liters. And he wanted to be able to understand, if we did set up these small reactors, could we reach the pathogen inactivation, because it hadn't been shown for these cases, being able to reach about 55 degrees C for about 3 days. So this is what he set out as a challenge within his work. So how he went to look at addressing it was first thinking about breaking it down to the fundamentals in terms of what's going on within this compost process, at least in a basic way, to think about what are the main parameters that he can change, to think about being able to get that temperature up to 55 degrees C for 3 days. So he set out an analytical model of what was happening within the compost process, not looking through all, you can get really, really detailed, but he wanted to boil it down to at least the basics that he could do to think about designing these small reactors to be able to try to think about, getting it down to those volumes. So this is the basic model, and I'm just going to break it down. So he looked at modeling the rate of change of the compost temperature, and looked at how that was related to different factors that he could control, such as the mass of the overall compost. This is something which you could characterize, the overall degradation rate of the feedstock. The container that he's setting up, how well insulated it is from thinking about the ambient temperature. The evaporation rate of water from the compost, and the aeration rate. So if you're actually putting in a fan to be able to provide air into this composter. So he took and broke down this model, and then looked at what can we do to be able to think about can we get this down to small volumes. So we ran a series of small volume experiments to be able to characterize different aspects of this model. So this is a picture of his setup that he had. So this is a relatively small, this is about a 20 liter container or so. And what he did is he set it up, so he had his dry toilet feedstock from the dry toilet, which is feces and sawdust mixed together. And then he basically put a pipe down through the middle, which he attached on a fan, just a simple computer fan on the top, so he could provide some aeration. And then just use basically, these are basic materials you could get from his local Home Depot, so it's just basic insulation. To be able to think about, can we take this and do this at a really simple and at a small scale? Then he put some instrumentation in there to be able to characterize what was happening throughout the composter. And this is what he found. So he started off with some initial experiments, the ones on the left. And so this was something which he did with a relatively small mass, around 2.5 kilograms. And he found, okay, so he could actually go through, and the model could actually characterize pretty well what was happening here. But then he wanted to see, okay, can I reach those pathogen inactivations for these small volumes? So then he used the model to explore a range of parameters to do that. And he found if he's able to boost the mass up, not too huge, not to 1 cubic meter, and revise a little bit in terms of how he was applying his aeration, he would be able to reach those types of temperatures. So if he changed the mass from 2.5 kilograms to 5.1, and changed the aeration rate down a little bit, you need to have some aeration to give enough oxygen for the reaction to happen, but not so much that it's cooling it down. So by reducing down the aeration rate, he was able to actually get those temperatures in the small volumes, and show that it is feasible to take it from this 1 cubic meter huge compost pile down to something which is a lot smaller, and reach those pathogen inactivations. So he was able to reach it. So using only a simple compost setup. So right now, what he's doing is to try to understand really what are the boundaries, to try to think about these small volume composting, to help inform people if they're trying to think about doing this on the household scale. So that's an example of 2 case studies that we've been doing in my group, where people have been thinking about some approaches towards advancing SDG 6 and trying to generate new knowledge or new products which can advance SDG 6. But another piece that we've been thinking about in my own group is thinking about, when people actually develop these types of technologies, what makes it something that people actually want to use? People can develop the best idea or the best widget in the world, but who cares, frankly, if it's not used by the people who need it most in the end? So we've been doing actually some newer work in my group trying to understand a little bit about that. So what? What makes it something that makes what are the factors which contribute towards people adopting a technology and thinking more about how someone uses the technology. And in some of this work, we're partnering with an organization, Isla Urbana, who does large-scale rainwater harvesting initiatives in Mexico. So I'll come back to Isla Urbana in a minute and some of the results we have from some of our surveys which we've been doing with them. So to start off with this work, when we were actually thinking about factors that influence whether someone's going to adopt and use a technology, we started where everyone kind of should start when they do a research project. We started by looking at the literature, and we found that there was a lot of work which was thinking about technology adoption, particularly technology adoption within thinking about smallholder farmers and new different types of technologies, right? Whether that would be, improved varieties, mechanism and infrastructure, all those different things that may help improve production for smallholder farmers. So when we found all these studies, we thought, is there something that we can do to try to extract out some synthesis of what these technology adoption studies are really telling us? So we put those all together, and we saw what parameters were common between these different types of studies. We found that there was a lot of parameters out there thinking about the socioeconomic demographics of the farmers, the actual farms themselves, and more about the implementation of the project, these exogenous factors, and more about the implementation of these types of technologies. So we decided we could think about taking a synthesis of this different data we could find in literature, and then we could think about, could we think about employing some statistical tools to try to understand what trends exist when thinking about whether someone would take up and use this technology in the end, or whether they would just abandon it. So we started with this in mind. We were able to find 189 different studies from 189 different kind of sets of data from 111 different studies, and had a pretty diverse geographical distribution. And then we did a number of different statistical analyses on this data to try to understand what kind of main trends we could see from across these different studies. I'm just going to show you one of those sets of analyses. If you want to get more details in terms of the overall study and what was done, there's a QR code there. I can kind of send you a link afterwards as well. But we went through and we found, so this is one of the results when we actually looked at analyzing the data to be able to develop an odds ratio. What an odds ratio is, it's a probability that the farmer is going to adopt the technology. And so it's something where it's, the higher odds ratio means that the higher odds that the farmer is going to adopt the technology, and if it's greater than 1, it means that there's a positive correlation with adoption less than 1, a negative correlation with adoption. And so here I'm plotting across a range of different input parameters that we have. And so and I'm showing here the error bars are showing 1 standard deviation up and below the mean for the odds ratio that we found. So basically it's these parameters that are to the right with the error bars all overlapping the 1, which has some statistical significance in terms of being predictors of adoption. So we found, and these are things which kind of make sense when we went through and did this analysis, that having the farmer having access to credit was something which was significant if they're going to think adopting these types of newer agricultural technologies. If they had land tenure, another thing which would be would increase their likelihood of adopting a new technology. If they had access to extension workers, access to people that were supporting the program, they had more probability of adopting the technology, and if they were a member of a larger farmers organization. So these were the ones which were more significant in the overall analyses. But these are things that you might expect. And overall, we found, we went through, we did this, we found some useful information, and we found some things that you might expect. We confirmed that those things are important. But for individual technology, we found, really need to have something which is specific to the particular context of that technology. So we did this work thinking about agriculture, because there's a lot of data out there in the literature. But then more recently, we've been supporting this organization, which is doing work thinking about water access in Mexico, Isla Urbana. So in Mexico, it is a place which is water stressed. 57% of Mexican households lack access to safely managed water. And then it also has 37% of Mexicans also lack access to safe sanitation. So you can see, and it's in the Mexican context, is like it is a lot of places globally, it's getting harsher and harsher every year because of climate change, and there's more and more regions which are experiencing these types of severe droughts. So what happens within this water stressed area in Mexico? What does the water infrastructure look like? So this is in the same kind of settings that that Pablo was working in terms of thinking about his sanitation solutions. And a lot of those settings, they'll rely on intermittent. Sometimes they'll have intermittent piped water. They will either that, or they'll have truck water. So these big water trucks, like the picture on the right, which will come to different households and deliver water, or they'll buy bottled water. But there's very poor regulation and control over all those different water sources. So there has been really interest to think about rainwater harvesting in this context, to be able to fill some of this gap which exists within that water infrastructure in Mexico, because there isn't secure, safe centralized water distribution. So we are partnering in this work with an NGO which works in Mexico, Isla Urbana, which has installed 35,000 rainwater harvesting systems since 2009. It's actually, I think, overall they've sold at least just at households at least that many as well. So total, so they've installed 35,000 themselves, but probably over 70,000 of their systems are installed in different areas in Mexico. And they are participating in large government programs where they're working with different communities to install these systems. But they had some concerns because, at least in the literature, from other types of rainwater harvesting systems, they had seen that there had been reports of large numbers of these systems not being used long term and not being operated in a way that promoted best water quality. So they wanted to work with us to understand, for the systems that they're installing, what happens after they've installed them, and to try to think about coming back and assessing what they were doing. So they've been working in Jalisco since 2021, And in Jalisco, this is around the area of Guadalajara. They've installed 8,000 systems since 2021. And so we were going with them to assess what they installed in 2022 and 2023 this past summer. And each year they installed about 4,000. They installed about 4,000 systems. So we went and we actually did a survey with them this past summer. And I'm just going to show you what some of the preliminary findings are from that and what we're thinking about going forward. We went into this survey to try to understanding what adoption looks like and looking at overall system adoption. We wanted to understand how that related to the perception the users have of the system. And then we wanted to also assess how people were using their systems, what the water quality looks like. I'm not going to have time to go into all these different things today. I'm going to focus in on number 1 and number 3, just to show you what some of this data looks like and thinking about what we're going to be doing going forward. So this is what these rainwater harvesting systems look like, to give you a little bit more context. So the number 1 on the right there shows where the water would come into the system off the roof. You have your roof, which is hooked up to some downspouts, and it goes into this pipe. Then it goes through a leaf filter to take out the big debris. And then what happens is the first amount of water that falls off the roof will fill up, which is something called a caloque, or a first flush diverter. So the first amount of water that falls off the roof fills that up. And it's set that way because the first amount of water which comes off the roof is rinsing off everything that's come there since the last time it rained. So that can be, bird poop in these areas. Dogs are running around up on the roofs. It can be industrial. If you're in an industrial area, there can be emissions from the local kind of industry that can form on the roofs. And if it's been long since the past rainfall, there can be a lot of debris, and that first amount of water can be really, really dirty. So they divert that first amount of water into the first flush diverter and store it there. And then once the first flush diverter is filled, the rest of the water will go into their water tank. And they'll either draw water just directly from the bottom of the water tank, or they may have a pump attached to a filter with which they will pump the water out of the tank. So that's what one of these typical systems look like. And then what we found when we actually went and did this observation, so we went and we visited about 10% of the installations from 2022 and 2023, so with a large team, and gathered a range of different data. But what we found were, these are just some of our observations. First was that, adoption can look different in different contexts, right? So what we found was for households that really valued the system, they not only, have been using it, but really they've taken it and they've adapted it to what they really needed. So they would they've taken it and they directly coupled it up to different irrigation systems if they wanted to use it for irrigation or other things as well. Some people, put plants, place them really, really close next up to the rainwater harvesting system. So, I think for households that adopted it, it's not necessarily what we found and what we're thinking more about is that adoption isn't something which is binary. In most of these studies, they say adoption is something either you adopt or don't, but there's different levels of adoption. So we're thinking more about how we can think about thinking this as more of a fluid thing rather than a binary metric. We found that maintenance is something which is an issue for these types of systems. The tanks themselves are really big and they should be cleaned out. The big storage water tanks is something which is actually really hard, especially for many of the populations are elderly. So thinking about maintenance is something which probably should be done much more comprehensively when doing these types of installations. And thinking about those aspects are really critical. But let's look at some of the data, some of the comprehensive data that we also gathered. So if we are looking at adoption as a binary metric, we found that there were a large number of the systems that were still working after being installed 2 years later, which actually is good for this particular program. Some other programs which were reported have reported adoption being much lower. 60% or less. So this looks pretty good. About after 2 years after being installed, there's still 83% of them are working, being used to harvest rainwater. Some of them were disconnected when we went there, and different reasons were reported for them being disconnected. When we were talking to the households, we found that some of them said they were remodeling, which means they needed to move the system or doing different things. So there was still a good number if you're thinking about adoption as just being a binary metric. We also looked at aspects of water quality and tried to understand a little bit about how well, thinking more again about adoption necessarily being a binary metric. There can be different levels of adoption. We're also thinking about, aspects of how well the system is operated and maintained are really critical as well. So we were also looking at assessing water quality. So when we were doing our surveys, we actually did, there are things that the households are supposed to do to help maintain water quality. First, after the rainfall, they're supposed to empty out that first flush diverter. And then the other thing that they are supposed to do is they have some filters, and they're also supposed to be fluoridating within their large storage tank. So during each household we visited, we did an assessment, first at both a qualitative assessment of the water quality and a chlorine test. We haven't been able to assess all the chlorine tests yet, but this is just some assessment based on the qualitative data, where we would rank the water from either being very dirty to very clean. So very dirty, for example, is something which is really, the water was turbid, we couldn't see the bottom of the tank, and there could be insects which would be inside. Whereas very clean would be like this image on the, the image shows with the red label is showing very dirty, and very clean is the one on the top right where the water is clear, there's no insects, and barely any sediment in the bottom of the tank, so the tank had been cleaned appropriately. So we looked at this, and when we were looking at the water quality overall, the plot on the bottom right, which might be a bit small for you to see, we found that about 66% of the households had very clean or clean water. We wanted to, whereas the rest of the households had lower water quality. We wanted to explore this in a little bit more detail to understand what factors, and we're still exploring this, what factors really could contribute to the fact of how, this is more of a fact of how the households are operating and maintaining the system. So we're really looking at assessing this data now, but one thing that we did ask during the survey, we did ask questions which assess the knowledge of the users and their understanding of what the different components of the system did. So we went through and did a test, a statistical test, a chi-squared test, which looked at understanding if there was a correlation between their knowledge of what that first flush diverter did and the obtained water quality. So if there was no knowledge, what we would have expected in terms of a distribution of households for what it would look like across the different water qualities, based on what they understood, whether it was the correct role, partially correct, incorrect, or not sure. This was what the distribution would look like, but this is the distribution that we saw. And it might not be completely evident when you look at it, but maybe if you look at the dark blue line, you'll understand a little bit more. The dark blue line is the line which represents if someone has knowledge of the correct role to locate. So what you'll notice is for that dark blue line, there were no households which we observed that had very dirty or dirty water. Some of them had regular water, I guess, which is kind of, still has low turbidity, but there's some sediment at the bottom. But most of the households had this clean or very clean water. So there is actually a statistical relationship based on this chi-squared test that tells us with a p-value of 0.03 that there is a correlation between thinking about knowledge of what the system does and water quality. So this is just some preliminary data because we're still going through and assessing more of this because we have this huge data set and it's pretty unwieldy. But that's just a quick preview of some of the things we're going to be uncovering as we go through this data in the coming months. So there is a correlation between this knowledge and obtained water quality. And we're analyzing right now so we can understand what else is contributing to these aspects of people really, doing good operation and maintenance, and thinking more about the fact that the adoption is not necessarily this binary metric, but something which is more continuous. Something else that we noticed was that sorry? Yeah, it's actually, I'm right, you're right, I'm right on target, 2 minutes, should be good, yeah. That there was some inconsistency in the survey responses. So, and we have a desire to think about how training and different factors can influence adoption and adaptation. So what we're actually currently working on right now in the group as well is actually putting instrumentation, low-cost instrumentation, into these systems so we can understand really for a subset of households how they're actually operating and maintaining this system. Understanding when it's raining, are they emptying, how much it's raining, are they emptying this taloke as they're supposed to after it rains to be able to maintain good water quality? And are they reaching cases where they would have, so how much rain they're actually collecting? And are they reaching cases when they're actually running out of water within their water tanks? So we're understanding that. And we're actually working with some other collaborators that are actually collaborating with other people at IITB, actually using this mesh network developed by York Lepar to actually put these sensors and be able to gather this data from the field. So yeah, that's just a quick snapshot of some of the types of things we're doing in my lab, thinking about this overall design process. I gave some cases where we're actually thinking about going through this, where we really start from the understanding the fundamentals of what the problem is, and really boiling it down. And then also understanding, right now we're trying to understand how we can close this loop to think about what are the factors which really influence whether someone adopts a system, and it's going to have the desired impacts. So with my last minute that I was given, or my last 2 minutes, so this is my work for my own group, but I also am the director of a cross-disciplinary center at University of Toronto called the Center for Global Engineering, where we collaborate with people all over to think about how we can use the skills which we have within engineering to benefit the world's most vulnerable people. And this is where the collaboration which we have going on with Satara came from. So if you want to find out more, you can I'll show up a QR code in a minute. So thanks a lot to my awesome research team. They're really wonderful, and all of our sponsors. And I'll take any questions you may have. Yeah, if you want to find out more about my group, you can scan the QR code. Or if you want to find out more about the Center for Global Engineering, it's also there. Thanks so much.
So thank you, Professor. Beautiful lecture and a lot of diversity of work. My question is related to the first step, where you are monitoring the soil water potential. So which depth you are considering? But because in India there are a lot of multi-cropping systems there. So in which depth you can?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, good question.
Another small thing, like in that water collection,
Yes.
the tanks that you are talking about knowledge of the user. So what kind of knowledge you are talking about?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll start with the question about the irrigation controller and the soil water potential. For us, we're doing it at 30 centimeters right now, just because that's kind of the mean root depth of the plants that we were thinking at. But it's actually very easy. It's basically just changing the length of a tube. So if you wanted to do it deeper, it could easily be set up in a way which it could be deeper. If it's multiple cropping, it's an interesting question. What would be the right way to go about, like choosing what the depth would be based on the plants that are there? But it's probably something we could think through, like a logic, what would make the most sense. But yeah, what we do is we try to set it around the root depth of the particular plants that we're trying to do. We've been doing it about 30 centimeters. And then about user knowledge. Yeah, so what we did is we asked So that question I was looking at showing that there is a correlation that we saw between water quality in the rainwater harvesting system and user knowledge. What we did in the survey is we asked the households to explain to us what the Toloke did. So we asked them to explain what it did, so that's the first flush diverter, and how they should use it. So if they had the right, we had four different levels. I'm just going to go back and then we had 4 different levels of response. So we had correct roll where they had it right on, partially correct roll where they would where they basically said something, but we should empty it after each rainfall. So they kind of had some idea, but not necessarily 100% reason why. Is this blue line with orange dots? Incorrect roll where they were wrong, and then the last pink one is where they weren't sure. They basically said, "Oh, I'm not sure what it does." So we found that out by asking them to explain to us what they thought the Toloke did.
Is anyone else? Yes. Choose yourself and next.
Hello, hi ma'am, my name is Joanne and I'm a PhD student here. The first question that I had is regarding the sanitation part.
Yes.
Where you said that if you maintain 55 degrees Celsius for 3 days, you can actually compost it. So the question is, I don't know how that temperature is maintained. Isn't there a trade-off where instead of using water, you have to use energy to maintain that? So is that looked into?
Yeah.
So that is one thing.
Yeah, so how it's maintained is basically there's a chemical process that's happening during the composting process that releases heat. So if I go back to that equation, there's like the heat of that process. That HC is basically the heat of that compost that's being generated in that composting process. So it will self-generate heat from the actual. There's no external heat for this case. You could apply an external heater is another way if you wanted to try to make it so it would maintain those temperatures. We're trying to keep it as low energy and as simple as possible. Pablo, in his earlier phases of the work, tried to do it without active aeration, and he found if you really wanted to get it down to the small volumes, he needed some active aeration, which is why he just has, he needed to have a fan just to give enough air, and that's enough air just to. One of the inputs to that composting process is that it needs to have air, like oxygen as an input for being able to do them. So we need to have the fan to just provide enough air that it's able to do that process, but not so much that it takes away the heat that's being generated during the actual composting process.
And the dry materials that you talked about, the generally sand.
It's sawdust, yeah.
Sawdust.
Yeah, yeah. But you could use different things. He's using sawdust, but you could use dried grass as another common input. And then I think it's just the ratio, and this is part of what he's doing right now, is to try to understand the sensitivity in some of those parameters, because depending on what you're adding in the compost process, there's a couple things which are important, which is the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the compost, and that helps govern how the process happens, and also the moisture content. And if you add grass versus sawdust, the amount that you should be adding would be a little bit different than if you add sawdust. But he's understanding kind of how sensitive those parameters are right now to be able to maintain that 55 degrees C for 3 days within that small volume.
And just one thing, on slide number 32, there is access to credit, which I didn't the odds ratio part.
Yes.
So what does access to credit in this case?
Yeah, so I guess there could be, so this was a student, Satya, who did this work, and he looked at a range of different agricultural technologies, whether it's like improved varieties, it might be different types of mechanization, so maybe it's some new equipment for our farm. So we looked at different types of technologies, and access to credit would be if the farmer is able to take out a loan and has access to be able to, has access to a financial means to be able to take out a loan. to be able to acquire that technology. So being able to have some ability to take out a loan. So that's big. Sorry, I can hear you. Access to extension workers. So that's actually basically someone that would come and visit the farm to help support the implementation of the technology. Yeah. So access, it's an extension worker. Yeah. So these kind of make sense. I think like if you're able to have a loan, it's more likely that you have the finance. So I think the things that he found tended to make sense. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So many times when farmers or whoever they are developing these technologies often have to depend on some kind of financial burden to adopt these technologies.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to improve one particular SDG, it might have a negative impact on SDG 1. So has any study been made on like how does it negatively affect, not affect? Also there is dependence on the Western technology and mostly the users are global south, not necessarily India, anywhere. So mainly the problem is IP issues. Like once the technology is IP, it becomes difficult for users to reproduce it or use it locally. How do you see, or how can you possibly address these issues?
Good question. So I think the overall, I think your comment about the SDGs being interrelated is a really good one. I think the goal when you're thinking about, some of these types of technologies, yes. So like if you're going to improve your access to water and sanitation, potentially there might be a small decrease in SDG 1 initially, right? But the hope would be overall that the fact that say if you're able to, so maybe say you're installing one of these rainwater harvesting systems on your property, right? It may be expensive at the beginning, but the hope is that if you are able to design a product which is good, in the end it should have financial benefit, and it should have health benefits and other things in the end, which would hopefully in the end advance SDG 1, even though it might decrease, it might decrease initially. So that's the hope. I haven't necessarily seen, but they may exist. I don't know the literature. All of the literature. There may be studies which look at the interrelationships between the SDGs, and there may be some details out there in literature and cases that look at those types of things for particular those particular interrelationships for particular cases. Okay, and your second question. Remind me your second question. Sorry.
Technology transfer issues.
Oh, technology. That is a really great question, and I don't know if there's a great answer to it. So I think there needs to be some thoughts around it. I know that there has been work, particularly thinking more about access to medical goods, which has kind of broken down some of the barriers when thinking about some of these IP-related issues across borders, particularly thinking about the global south. But I think there needs to be some thought around that, especially when it's thinking about providing things which are essential for having a good quality of life. It's a good question, and I wish I had the right answer for how to address IP issues in a very broad way. I think some of the things could be. It depends. I think there's a push towards thinking about open science, right? Open access to different things. But I think this is a trade-off, right? Because it's always being able to do the research and development takes money and takes time. And this is the whole. I think there's a lot of issues with IP in general, but I don't. Yeah. So I wish I had a good answer. If you have any great ideas, yeah.
Anyone from this side?
I think is in a sense taking further from the earlier question. What intrigued me was you said it is SDG 6 centric. And I could very easily see that it was hugely SDG 5 centric, water and sanitation.
Yeah.
Especially if you look at that together in tandem with the access to credit and access to extension, the gender dimension becomes
Yeah,
extremely important.
this is I think SDGs kind of come and merge
So,
together.
so I thought when you are looking at water and sanitation, engineers miss gender usually. So that's why I was little intrigued about that. And the second issue was that when we are looking at either availability of clean water, what logically sounds to me is that if you look at the waterborne disease pattern in the same community, you will find first that diarrhea goes down, then other waterborne disease, typhoid, and lastly the jaundice. And this is something which has been seen in the Indian rural settings where the sanitation portion has improved. So it might be a good metric to look at just the incidence of waterborne diseases came down sharply. So any comment on the first part which I said about SDG 5?
Yeah. So, I think the SDGs are really interrelated, right? I think and it kind of came up with your question, right? I think, they're overall, it's like thinking about sustainable development and different aspects of that go hand in hand together. So I think I framed it in terms of SDG 6, but I think it's, they all kind of go hand in hand together. And then the second question, can you just rephrase it again?
Waterborne disease.
Waterborne diseases. Yeah, so we've actually been talking about that for the context of what we've been doing with, on the rainwater harvesting work as well. I think it's a bit challenging because they don't use the rainwater harvesting for they don't use it for all of their water needs. So I think that's part of what we're coming up against is to try to think about it given the context that it doesn't provide 100% of their water. And they actually use this for more. They use this for more of their household needs, to tell you the truth. I didn't go into all the details behind all of the data, but when we were looking at how they use it and perceive it, they use it mostly for like cleaning. They use it for doing irrigation. They use it, but there is a stigma against using it for drinking. Some households do use it for drinking after going through filters. So we're trying to understand a little bit more about that too. So there's a lot of richness in that data I didn't get a chance to go into. But, it's a good point. We are thinking about if there's aspects related to that we could look at.
Anyone else?
So we spoke about the play pump in the beginning.
Yes.
So the pumping part was a problem for the whole model, but rest of the things like actually getting the infrastructure there, the tank and the drilling board, these are still functional. Only thing we need to change is the pumping part. So was that project continued further? I mean, this happens many a times with us as well. Like many a times people work on some brilliant projects for their MTech thesis or PhD, but it is later not exactly continued.
Yeah.
And we tend to reinvent the wheel again and again.
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure for the play pump. There's not a whole lot of data out there that I've been able to find about what happens to the sites afterwards. And I think this is maybe part of, maybe it would play into some of the things. There could be opportunity to think about that, maybe study it more comprehensively, because I think there were maybe 4,000 or so which were deployed overall. So there was a decent number. But I don't know, how the community adapt, or how those sites were maybe adapted afterwards. And there might be different factors at play whether that site was adapted. Similar, I was talking about the rainwater harvesting. There are certain populations which will take it and then really make it their own and adapt it, right? We're trying to understand what is it that influences those factors. So I don't know what would make it so, the community would take that site and potentially adapt it into something which would be useful for their needs. And I haven't seen the data in terms of what happened to the sites afterwards.
Anyone else? This is the title related to sustainability, and
Yes.
then we have been talking about these informations in
water solutions, sanitation, etc. Ultimately, it depends on people's attitude and habits.
Yes, yes.
And you have been working in diverse geographies, as you mentioned, in Africa, South America. So, how do you tackle that issue? Because ultimately, engineering and technology is part of the solution. But ultimately, what can drive this sustainability? Have you got some insights into that through your projects that are going on in this space?
Yeah. So I think what pushes towards like thinking about sustainability and project sustainability things, it goes into thinking about the overall implementation and when we're some of the work that we're doing, this is I kind of think the nature of research. Some of it is more fundamental things. We're working in the lab, right? We're trying to understand some fundamental properties, and that's the nature of sometimes what we do in the research. But other times, we're trying to think about taking things from beyond the lab out into the field, and for to be able to do that in a sustainable way, I think that needs to be done with appropriate partnerships in place and the right people to kind of do that translation. That's partially why I like the project with Isla Urbana. It's an organization that does large-scale field work. They have an interest in research, and they have an interest in thinking about how they can try to do things in a better way. And I think that's the way they can think about more about how the work can be done sustainably. Because we can't do it in the lab. We're we have students that go through PhD 4 years to doing a PhD, right? And 2 years for a master's, right? If you want to think about something which is sustainable, it needs to be with a longer term relationship.
Do these participants pay for example, the water tanks? So in case of the water solutions,
Yes.
so do they contribute towards the facilities that they are receiving?
So we do have some collaborative projects with Isla Urbana where we get funding coming to us. Other times we apply for some funding together to support the overall program.
So the individual beneficiaries?
Individual households. So there's different ways that Isla Urbana does their projects. So some of them are government programs where the households don't have to pay. And some of them are households which do pay for the actual systems themselves. The programs which we were monitoring were households where they didn't have to pay, and it was a large-scale government program. There is a lot of work which is looking at understanding how the relationship between investment from the households and long-term adoption. For this particular subset that we were looking at, there was something which was actually free, but the households needed to put effort in to become part of the program. So there were different things they had to do to be able to. It wasn't just like someone knocked on their door, "Do you want this?" They had to go participate in a number of things before it was installed. So they had to pay not with money, but pay with effort.
Are there any questions? Otherwise, we'll close the session formally. Last chance.
Amy is here till the 18th. If anyone wants to meet her, you can always get her.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
So with that, let us thank Professor Amy for the wonderful talk. She has traveled all the way to India at a difficult time, and hope she returns back safely.
Me too.
And I'm sure after such long travel, she must be jet lagged, and she has to get restored stability as well. I also for that. And thank you once again, and I request Professor Bakul to hand over a small memento to you for.
This is from Gandhi Ashram.
There is something called
Seva Mandal. It was set up by Vinoba.
Yes, please.